A very good afternoon to all of you. So, this is the book for which I'm very honored to have been invited here at GALF, and I'm very grateful to all the organizers. Yeah, you can see that on your screen also. So, it's called Celebrating India in 75 Buildings. What do you think that this a book like this would contain? Like, which examples do you think it would contain? Anyone?
Ban
Taj Mahal for sure.
Parliament,
Anyone else?
the count,
Hmm? The Parliament building, the old one or the new one?
Fifth Lord,
Anyone else would like to take a guess? How many of you are architects here in this audience, if I may know?
we play a printer.
Yeah, very few. I'm so happy about this fact. Yeah, because yeah, this book is mainly for you. Okay, and so yes, you would expect Taj Mahal to be there. Uh, I was holding up this book somewhere else, and I asked this question, and they said the temple at Konark, the temple at Tanjavur, and you mentioned the British colonial buildings, right? So you would expect something like this because when we talk about great buildings of India, naturally our imagination would go back to our glorious architectural past, and in doing so, we somewhat neglect what happened in our recent past or not so very recent past. Okay, so this book is, why 75 buildings? So this book was brought out specifically to celebrate 75 years of Indian independence. And this book contains a selection of 75 examples of post independence Indian architecture. All right. So, this is what the lecture is going to be. It's called Architecture After Independence Concepts and Conversations Over 75 Years. So, on the eve of independence, Pandit Nehru, our first Prime Minister, delivered a speech in the Constituent Assembly, and it is considered one of the greatest speeches of 20th century. And he said, I quote, "Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. Now the time has come when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom." Independence was indeed a momentous event for India, which was, again to quote him, the ancient, the eternal, and the ever new, but it was stepping into becoming a modern democratic republic. There was fervor all around in all walks of life where people wanted to participate in the making of the new republic, of the new nation. What was the story of Indian architecture after independence? The book is about that, and it would be interesting for all of us to know a little bit about that. But let's see what was the scenario before independence. So, and I'm fully aware that the colonial scene in Goa was different, but in the rest of the country, mostly there was British Raj, as you know. So, what we see before independence, architecture of the Raj was heavily into revival of old styles like classical and Gothic revivals. That is basically borrowing from the historical buildings, uh, European, and then later from Indian buildings as well. So here, what you see is the famous museum in Bombay, what we know as in Indo-Saracenic style, that blends features of several Indo-Islamic styles. And what you see here on the right, Any idea which building is that? On the right?
Bastion.
That's the Rashtrapati Bhavan, right? The Vice Regal Lodge in its earlier avatar, and that's the new British capital in New Delhi, what we call Lutyens Delhi, which was largely a blend of classical European uh, ideas and elements and some of the Indian elements from the Buddhist and Mughal past. In short, the British sponsored almost no modern buildings in India as part of the empire. Okay. However, side by side, while New Delhi was being designed and built around the same time, side by side, in 19 late 1920s and 1930s, there was a different story unfolding in Bombay largely, where several homegrown Indian practices were inspired by the winds of change in the West. And they were making residential, commercial, and cinema theaters like these, using modern materials in what is known as Art Deco style. These buildings reflected changing ways of living and working in Indian cities. Now, these architects were very prolific and they were building all over major cities in the undivided India. For example, the Mandovi Hotel in Goa was designed and built by a very prolific architecture firm in Bombay, Master Sate and Bhuta. So that was going on before independence. We must also remember that this modernity, the new ways of living that I was talking about, this modernity was also a reflection of social and political churning in the country. We can say that several factors came together for it. Spread of education led to awareness of our social and political condition. Reformist movements, for example, led by the great Jyotirao Phule and his wife Savitri Bai and their associates, and the freedom struggle. Both these were working in tandem towards a social and political change. Also, there were changes in technology that brought about new ways of living. So one important factor for creeping modernity in Indian life was also the infusion of new technology by the Raj itself. For instance, the railways. Now we know that the British brought railways to India for purposes which were basically to transport armies and to transport raw material to the major port sites. But there was an unintended consequence, and that was that the railways connected places and people like never before in this country, and it had a great impact on our society and also on our freedom struggle. If those of you who have watched David Attenborough's Gandhi, I believe everyone has, and you would know that how Gandhi traveled all across the country in the third class compartment, right? So yes, so there was new technology. When it comes to building, the use of iron and steel was introduced in late 19th century, and the use of concrete in early 20th century. So embracing new technologies was a defining feature of modernism, and that was already being practiced in a manner before independence. So the question is, what changed after independence, right? Now, in creative spheres, other than architecture, let's say, such as arts, literature, theater, there was a huge churning. We see winds of progress were greatly fueled by the optimism brought about by independence. For instance, the Progressive Artist Group, or the PAG, which was founded in 1947, they are known as Bombay Progressives. They rebelled against the academic styles and charted a modern path. The progressive writers movement defied all literary traditions viciously. Cultural, moral, literary, and linguistic traditions, they rebelled against it. It was a declaration of war by the youth of the middle class against the prevailing social, political, and religious institutions. Modern theatre immediately took shape with IPTA and then with pioneers like Ibrahim Al Qazi. So, independence gave a major push to progressive movements in breaking away from traditional forms of making art. So, again, if that is so, what changed in architecture? Did anything change in architecture? So that's a story that I would kind of try to unfold. So one thing immediately after independence is that several new administrative, academic, scientific, and cultural institutions that were now being envisioned and being established needed buildings to house them. This resulted in a burst of public architecture promoted by the state and a great opportunity for the architecture profession to shape a new language for the republic, new architecture for new India, so to speak. In the first 2 decades of independence, we observe multiple impulses operating simultaneously. One of them was to conform to the language of Lutyens New Delhi, and this was championed by the CPWD architects of Delhi. The other impulse was to seek inspiration in the forms of India's rich architectural past. And the third one, directly inspired by Nehruvian optimism in modernity, was to seek a modernist expression. Now, instead of narrating a chronological story, my approach for today's session is going to be thematic. We will discuss the evolving themes, trends, and concepts visible in the Indian story. I will first speak about these three themes and followed up by nine more very quickly. So the first one, the CPWD built buildings in Delhi. Now, several new government buildings in New Delhi were being designed and built by the CPWD architects, and they were trying to fit into the context of Lutyens Delhi. For example, which is like the use of red and buff color stone, the blend of European and Indian features, etc. As you can see here in the Supreme Court building, and you can relate that to the one that I showed you earlier. The second impulse was drawing inspiration from India's historical past. So, highly modern functions, like convention centers, hotels, and even assembly buildings were built with new technology, but were styled with elements invoking past tradition. The Vidhan Sauda in Mysore state, today's Karnataka, is the best example of this, designed in what we can call a Neo Dravidian style. Yeah, it's a most grand example. The most dominant impulse, however, was to chart a rational modernist expression using modern technologies and rejecting historicism or applied ornamentation. Okay. These architects, such as Perin Mistry, Habib Rahman, Achyut Kanvinde, and Durga Das Bajpai, were truly the pioneers of Indian modernism, soon to be followed by Charles Correa and Balkrishna Doshi, embracing a belief in architecture of deep social commitment. They were aided by the state as well as private entities, both providing patronage towards setting up institutions and having an unfettered faith in new architecture of this kind. Now, these are the names that would perhaps be unknown to most architecture students as well. Yeah. And so this is what I mean, uh, uh, as to how, trying to always kind of hark back to a distant past, we are missing out on some of these very very important stories of the period immediately after we became independence. I will just take you to through a couple of them for the want of time. Perrin Mistry, for example, she was the first woman architect to have graduated formally from India. She graduated from Sir J. J. School of Architecture and then went to London to do her RIBA. Came back and joined her father, who had already a very very prolific practice in Bombay, right? Mistry and Bhedwar, uh, and she joined this firm as a partner. Yeah, so we can say that Perrin Mistry was the the first pioneer modernist architect, homegrown architect in India. And her style differed from her father, J.P. Mistry, the great J.P. Mistry. It is quoted that her style was rather distinct from that of her father's and her brothers. It was more simple, with cleaner lines and less ornate. It, yeah, the defining features of modernism, right? It personified her no nonsense, no frills thinking. Her buildings were functional, practical, easy to maintain, and still spoke loudly of character. Habib Rahman, who studied in Bengal Engineering College and was sent to MIT on a government scholarship, where he studied and then he trained under Walter Gropius. Similarly, Kanvinde, who was sent to Harvard, and he also trained under these pioneers of modernism. Both of them, they came back. Habib Rahman joined PWD of Bengal, and very soon this was the first of his project that came to light. That is Gandhi Ghat Memorial. That was commissioned soon after the Mahatma's assassination, and it was unveiled in 1949 in the presence of Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, if you see the design of this, right, in a very abstracted manner, he what he does is that he blends the features of traditional Islamic, Hindu, and even if you can even notice a cross. So he's basically trying to personify the Mahatma, in whose honor this is being built. And when Nehru came to inaugurate this, his first question: who is the architect? And Nehru was known for recognizing talent. And he invited Habib Rahman to come to Delhi, which he did after a few years to go on to become the chief architect of CPWD in Delhi, and had a long and prolific career in the government service. And he transformed the way of thinking of CPWD architecture at that time. So that's Habib Rahman. And as part of Bengal PWD, he also was responsible for the new secretariat building in Calcutta. Now, this was India's first tall building, built in steel frame construction, and you can already see thus the sun breakers, etc. This is very much a Walter Gropius building in India, right? And I would just like you to indulge here, and we saw the Vidhan Sauda earlier, and this one. These were being built almost at the same time, right? And they tell us, just very directly, visually, these two diverse impulses which are operating simultaneously. So that is also a testament that there was a diversity of architectural voices, right at the beginning, and yeah, similarly. But it is this rationalist modernist attitude that obviously has had most appeal, and it continued in the Indian cities. And but in a way that it was tempered by the local conditions and building practices, both. Yeah, and we will see how. And again, so to look at Habib Rahman and Achyut Kanvinde's buildings as they move along in their career, how it matures and how it no, it is much more cognizant of the local conditions. So that is very, very interesting to see. For both these architects, if we trace, we both had a long and prolific career. If we just trace their architectural evolution, I mean that's would be quite fascinating to do. Uh, the modernist aesthetics very strongly shaped the buildings for commerce as well. As we can see here, this modernist aesthetic contributed to a bold new urban fabric in the expanding parts of Indian cities. So the cities were expanding, the newer parts were having these commercial buildings coming up, and that kind of defined the new commercial areas in these cities. Coming back to the 1950s, and we had this one in major kind of a burst, on the architectural scene, and that was coming of Le Corbusier in India. So the Indian half of Punjab was in need for a capital city because Lahore went to the other side. A site was chosen at the foothills of Shivalik, and the Chandigarh project was going to come up. And there's a story behind it, but well, eventually Corbusier, who is one of the most prominent names, in international modernism, was chosen to carry out the master plan for Chandigarh and um, to design the important public buildings in Chandigarh, known as the Capitol Complex. So that is the legislative assemblies, the High Court, and the Secretariat buildings. And this is how they look. They look like, right? So, so yes. So the decade of 1950s, besides what I showed you earlier, also witnessed these landmark projects by Corbusier in Chandigarh. And he also did projects in Ahmedabad for private clients. So both these gave a definitive push to already thriving modernism in the country. The Corbusier's works in India are also distinct. Now that is something we have to remember. This also in a later part of his career, where again his work was changing, but perhaps we can say that kind of coming to India had a role to play in that. He's more open to exploit plastic quality of concrete, his use of sunbreakers, and his beton brute, the famous use of material in raw form. Now, besides concrete, even has material like bricks, the very traditional Indian materials. Uh, so, the next theme, which is even more important than the theme of Corbusier, is the impact of Corbusier on architectural scene that followed. So, several architects and engineers were inspired by Corbusier's visionary ideas and methods. Uh, One set is architects who directly worked with him on the Chandigarh project, and another set is the young architects who immediately were majorly influenced by his works. And this it also includes B.V. Doshi, by the way, who trained with him in his Paris office. So these are some of the buildings. Yeah, they are all three are in Chandigarh, designed and built by people who directly worked with Corbusier on the Chandigarh project. And you can see the use of curvaceous roofs and many materials in their raw form, etc. Yeah. And what is even more interesting is architects like J.K. Chaudhary and Shivnath Prasad, uh, who, as young people, got majorly inspired by Corbusier. So J.K. Chaudhary's IIT Delhi, Punjab University buildings, and several other campuses that he did in North India, right, are examples of that. And Shivnath Prasad, his several buildings in Delhi. And this also defines Indian brutalism, that is beton brut, which in French means raw concrete or raw material. So that is what was a Corbusian aesthetic, using materials in their raw and pure form. And all over the world, we see brutalist architecture in several forms. The Indian brutalism is really, I think, lyrical and poetic, right? And this is what we see over here, right? So most expressive use of beton brute in the world. Coming back to the 60s and 70s, yeah, these were the decades of great adventure where architects freely experimented with the potential of concrete technology, in which, in the words of Raj Reval, another young architect in the 70s, and he said, that was a time when nothing was impossible. Nothing was impossible. The Hall of Nations in Delhi exemplifies this optimism perfectly. This was also born out of productive collaboration between architect and structural engineer. And by the way, this project was a part of an open competition, and it was awarded as part of open competition, and it was coming up to commemorate the silver jubilee of Indian independence. 25 years of Indian independence. Why this is a remarkable building? Because it is the only one of its kind in the world, that it spans almost 75 meters of space with concrete space frames, without any columns in between. In other parts of the world, you will see space frames being built in steel. So here, this is also testament of Indian craftsmen working in the construction industry, who are making these such buildings in concrete. Because remember, to make buildings in concrete, again, it's almost a handmade product. All right, we'll come back to this building towards the end. The next theme, a search for Indian modernism, right? And this is something that we could say is something that the architects, right from the onset of independence and until today, are kind of grappling with this particular concern, right? In that. So yes, but while all this was happening, again, this very same architects were cognizant of local conditions and regional building cultures, and this brought nuance to their modernism. This was happening in India. It also happened in many places, what we call as global south. Yeah, it's also known as tropical modernism. So we can use these variety of terms to describe the kind of search for a regional modern, yeah, something that is going on. So many buildings from the middle decades of 20th century exhibit this particular desire for a search of Indian modern, the creation of sensitive, rooted, and yet very contemporary buildings. Uh, here are some of the examples: Korea's Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya, Doshi's Labour Institute, Stein's IIC, Brinda Somaya's the school in Baroda, and there's several and very many such examples that we can quote for this particular impulse. But to take the story forward, and by early 1980s, we also begin to witness a more pronounced churning of ideas and questioning of the modes of architecture dictated by the ideals of modernism. And in that, I would like to cite two two major events that happened. Right, two events in 1980s that shaped the discourse that followed. One is quite well known in architecture circle. The other, for a reason that really baffles me, is really not talked about much. Okay, and which are these two events that I'm talking about? The first one was the Vistara exhibition in 1986. That was a part of Festival of India exhibition that traveled in major cities all over the world and finally came back to India, and it was put up in Bombay in the Nehru Hall for several months, and everyone in the city. It really attracted a lot of lay audiences, okay, at that time from all over the country, and it had a major impact. The second event was the International Conference on Mud Architecture in 1987, organized by HUDCO. So these two lead us to our next two themes or impulses. Okay, and as I said, the first one is the impact of the Vistara exhibition. So the Vistara exhibition in 1986, it unearthed and popularized esoteric ideas from Indian mythology, such as Mandala, Manusha, and Manthana. It brought renewed interest in the historical and mythical forms. Many call this phase as India's postmodernism. However, I would say I mean, to apply this particular term would be erroneous, but let it be. Uh, the fact uh, that this exhibition in fact was pretty diverse and brought together several strains of Indian architecture, traditional as well as contemporary. Yeah, but what kind of remains in public memory is the mandala, the diagram. And if you think that there is this proliferation of vastu architects, then I can say that this was the kind of a moment after which it starts. But uh, Charles Correa, who was a major figure of the Vistara exhibition himself, and was kind of doing this, uh, his own works, and how it was influenced and inspired by these ideas. And for that, Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur is the best example, is the full blown example of this particular impulse that I want to talk about. And in a most playful, contemporary manner, he kind of he references these ideas from India's mythology, and also from the creative arts around India's mythology, right? And he does this, the Jawahar Kala Kendra. The next one, inspired by the second event of the 80s, is the emergence of alternative building practices. So the International Conference on Mud Architecture in 1987, what it did, it collated the workings of alternative practices rooted in the local and free from the baggage of styles or ideologies. And Laurie Baker was an important figure in this critical movement. All right. Laurie Baker's Center for Development Studies that he had designed and built in 1971, and of course few other projects built later on, were the central part of this particular conference. And this is I can't tell you how influential this particular project of Baker has been, and it influenced. So this conference took place, and immediately, young architects who came out of the colleges, who were inspired by this. So in the middle of the 90s, in mid 90s, late 90s, we have this crop of young Indian architects who are kind of making buildings like this. People like Suhasini Iyer, Anupama Kundu. Auroville was a great place for this kind of experimentation, but also the building centers, the movement inspired by the conference was also responsible for that. So yes, so it inspired a new generation of architects, right, to seek progressive ideas in architecture using local materials and craftsmanship, which is unburdened by dogmas of modernism or grand theories of styles. We see that here, yeah, in the works of this. We also see that in the works of Gerard de Cunha, the Goan architect, in this landmark project called Nityagram in Bangalore, the dance school for Protima Bedi, right? And it is a project like this, and this is, although this particular movement of alternative practice, although it is a niche movement, it is a small movement, but it is an ever enduring movement up until now. And one major figure in that is Chitra Vishwanath, practicing from Bangalore. Then I want to talk about this particular impulse, that is rationalism and sustainability. So that was this discourse. This discourse also emerges, by the way, in late 80s and early 90s. Okay, and it becomes stronger in the following decades, and that one is specifically focused on site and climatic conditions and seeking passive thermal solutions, yeah, using the scientific principles of kind of working with the sun, and what we know as passive thermal solutions. So very scientific rationalist approach towards making of architecture. Yeah, projects like this. In these projects, we see a remarkable environmental sensitivity and innovation, much before green architecture became a fashionable phrase. Again, a rationalism of this kind, free of stylistic concerns, remains an ongoing concern, as can be seen, for instance, in the Avasara Academy in Pune by Case Design. And then I want to talk about this particular impulse too, and that is the structural formalism, sculptural formalism. Yeah. So a predilection for sculptural forms and symbolic meanings, an ever present feature in traditional Indian architecture, continues to animate post independence architecture, even if applied ornament was consciously avoided. So this is something really very interesting, right? Because I mean, in traditional Indian architecture, the word for sculpture and architecture is one and the same, right? So there is this tendency of sculptural in architecture in the Indian psyche, right? The modernists, although they shunned the applied ornament, but now what they are doing is exploiting modern construction technologies and materials and its plasticity to give sculptural forms to contemporary buildings, and they exploit it thoroughly to make buildings like this, to mold fluid and contemporary forms aided by modern construction technology. In that sense, while they remain firmly within the modernist tradition, they are free from the compulsion of a white box, Another material freely exploited for its contemporary sculptural quality is brick. So Belgian embassy and Baha'i temple are very good examples of this. And we see this desire for formalism uh, throughout, and it continues in the works of many architects. Yeah, more recent. So there's Houses of Goa Museum by Gerard de Cunha again is a delightful example of this sculptural tendency. And in some of the more recent examples are Sai Mandir by C Studio and St George Church by Vinu Daniel, where sculptural quality of brickwork is used for tweaking the traditional form, yet retain a sense of familiarity. From the mid 1990s, the Indian story was taking a turn towards economic liberalization and rising GDP growth. Privatization shifted the patterns of patronage and the production of aesthetics in diverse ways because the state almost withdrew itself from commissioning new projects, and it was the private sector that majorly becomes the new patron. So globalization and market driven building industry had its share of impact on the changing nature of the profession. So the nature of the profession was changing, and the role of architects in the building projects was changing, and this had an impact on the resulting aesthetic, the building aesthetic that kind of comes up under this particular impulse of globalization, the aesthetics of free market economy, as we can perhaps describe it. Now, this is the last theme that I want to talk about, and we are in the new millennium, very very close to where we are, and therefore perhaps not yet the right moment to kind of analyze it completely. But in the new millennium, we can say that there is a proliferation of building activity. Yeah, all over there is construction happening. Uh, Good, bad, ugly, all kinds, right? And also there is a return of state patronage, right? So this is again changing the architectural scene in the country. But in that, there is a bright light in the emergence of multi-talented, globally aware niche practices in the new millennium, producing exciting work. And that is what interests someone like me. And I'm just showing you two examples because, yeah, I mean, one cannot really do, but practices like this, people who graduated, about 20 years back, or about 25 to 30 years back. Yeah, so some of these kind of works that are going on, right? So yes, so we discussed these 12 themes, not necessarily in a chronological order, but we saw that how like as the decades passed, we saw the emergence of these kind of trends as well, right? So this slide summarizes all the 12 points that we talked about today, and that again brings me to this particular slide and the idea of this book, right?
The dot sky cut. Yeah.
The idea of this book. Okay, so this book actually is a result of time pass,
That's just cool.
where in the college we say, okay, let's do some time pass, let's have some fun, and we said that let's make a list of 75 significant projects in the independence. And it was not easy. It was quite difficult, in fact. And uh, then one thing led to the other, and the book was made. Uh, it contains a selection of 75 significant projects. Yeah, very subjective kind of. I mean, obviously, it reflects the biases and the state of knowledge or ignorance of the list maker, of course. Uh, but it followed a certain laid down criteria, and I have described that in my essay over here. The book has an introductory essay by myself, another essay by my colleague, who also is one of those young emerging practices, and he writes about his own experiences. And then there is one by one the 75 in a more or less chronological order. Okay, so this lecture is not a direct translation. The book is different, the lecture is different, the idea is the same. So the book is available here in the bookstore, and it is priced very affordably, right, so that the students can also uh, can afford it. So do have a look at it, and if it interests you, do grab a copy for yourself. 10 minutes left. I'll take 2 more minutes to talk about this. So this is where. So whatever is contained in this book, or whatever we saw now, does that constitute our heritage or no? That is the question I would like to ask you, right? Is heritage only something that was built 5,000 years ago or 500 years ago, or something that was built 50 years ago or 5 years ago? Does that also constitute our heritage or not? And let me tell you that the world over, now, the modernist heritage of 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the significant examples are considered the heritage. They are given uh, state protection and turned into museums so that everyone can see them and appreciate them. Do we have it in India? Do we have it in our country? The answer is no. Uh, 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 Even among the architectural community, there is very little awareness of the fact that we should hold on to some of these significant modernist heritage of the country, for the simple reason is that in them is chronicled the story of our republic. Yeah, India may be an ancient country, but it is a young republic, and our story is inscribed in these buildings. So, to avoid something like this, right? The Hall of Nations. I was talking about it in the present tense, yeah, fully aware that I was using a wrong tense. It no longer exists. Yeah, it was a significant milestone, the only kind of example in the world. Uh, uh, and we have lost it uh, uh, as a result of state vandalism. And what are you going to do with Kala Academy? So just yesterday I was passing by, it was kind of perhaps repaired and restored. And my friend, Professor Fleur D'Souza, tells me that, yeah, for the time being, it is standing and it is going to. So hold on to it. Hold on to it. No, one of India's greatest architect is a son of Goa, and he has a building here in Goa. Hold on to it. And I since I showed you these slides, I want to end on a note of optimism. Where are we headed? And I want to show you uh, just these two practices, right? So, Flying Elephant Studio, and yeah, so you see this figure. So if you go to the websites, so here now this is a very good change, that no longer are many of these young progressive practices, multi-talented, diverse people, young people who are also coming from now from smaller towns in the country, because they have come to metros and studied architecture and now over there. Yeah, so you will see these multiple faces on the websites, not just some one prima donna architect. And a lot of good optimistic work is being done actually in repair and renovation, adaptation, reuse, extension of buildings and things like that. Yeah, very aware of the environmental concerns and the aesthetic sensibilities that our local materials and local crafts can afford. Okay. This is the last slide I will show you. Studio Lotus, similarly, diverse, multi-talented practice, and this extremely delightful project, Krishi Bhavan in Bhubaneswar, where now this is a government building. And what is the brief? The brief is reimagining the relationship between the state and its people. This is how public architecture, its brief should be prepared, and its manifestation should happen using patterns, textures, colors, evoking the traditions, inviting people in, being inclusive, and kind of projecting the image of a state as a protector, and not as someone who is okay, stay away from me and be afraid. So this to me would be the way forward for Indian architecture. Thank you.
Any questions from? Oh, hello. Thank you for this. A couple of questions. One was I wanted to know, when you kept mentioning the term "we" for the list of the 75 buildings. You said we came up. We were talking and we came up with this idea of having 75 monuments. Who did you mean by we? Was it your choice predominantly, or you were talking about a colleague and yourself?
Yeah, a few of my colleagues. So we kind of we made long list, and then we made short list, and then we again shortened. The final list is something that has my stamp on it, but
Okay.
It's not just my
Yeah,
work
that's-
alone.
yeah.
And my students. Yeah. So
Was it
so
75
this
because of
runners-
75 years of Indian independence? Was that because of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yes, yeah.
The second thing is, I wanted to know, there was this, when you're talking about the second scheme of things about that conference that you had that wasn't publicized very much, the second after the, and that there was something in Pondicherry that started out using the kilns. In a sense, the house was built as a kiln and it was used as a kiln, and then ultimately when the pots were removed, they were used as houses, which was run
That's
by
Ray Meeker. Yeah,
I was
Ray
just
Meeker in
exactly.
Auroville.
So I was wondering if that came under the same principles of what you were talking about.
Yes,
It
very
does.
much so.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So this what she's talking about is this very interesting case in Auroville. So Auroville in Tamil Nadu has been a place for a lot of architectural experimentation. So Ray Meeker is a potter, and so he and in Auroville there is also a lot of experimentation in earth technology and using on. So combining the two, so he made a mud house, and then used it to fire his pots. So the pots got fired and the house also got fired. Yes.
And finally, last, sorry, is that there's something called vernacular architecture. I mean, I'm just using it as a term that the architects who run that it's named as. And in fact, there's a company, I don't even know if it's called a company, an organization called Venarc, based in Bangalore, based on the principles of Laurie Baker. So I don't know if you've heard anything about it, or is that a term that's just used very loosely?
Right. So, I mean, vernacular architecture is a term which is widely used to describe all kinds of buildings, traditional buildings, or buildings that look like traditional buildings, or from from, for example, let's say the inner city areas of the cities. Something that is not modern looking is also sometimes called vernacular. I kind of I've stayed away from using that term because what Laurie Baker does, for example, I wouldn't call it vernacular architecture. Yeah, right, right. He, in fact, what he does is, I mean, he's most of his works in Kerala, okay, and the buildings don't look like actually the traditional Kerala architecture, but they are very very much rooted in the ground, right? So, based on that, I think Ranjit has a question.
My thoughts. Sorry, Smita, thank you in the first place. Very fascinating and stimulating lecture. It was just an observation, but also seeking your thoughts. In the way you presented the material, the early 1980s really stand out as a time when people were turning back in different ways. Charles, on the one hand, with Pravina Mehta, to this more mythic, metaphorical explanation of the past, but also projects like Anandgram with Revati Kamath, working with a clientele that was not, they weren't really traditional patrons, they were displaced people with whom she was building a colony, as well as this turn to what Aarti was talking about, roughly not, I wouldn't say vernacular architecture so much as prior techniques that were coming into the work of people like Laurie Baker or Sanjay Prakash, whole range of people. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how that also reset the way in which architects conceived of their practice, not with the state as patron, not with corporations, but also often seeking communities or,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about that?
It definitely required on the parts of those architects an ability to work with the communities for something like that. And I use the term alternative practices to describe the works of Laurie Baker, Revati Kamath, and the host of Auroville architects who were inspired by that. So what they are doing is, in their practice, they are contemporizing the traditional building material or construction practices, right? So we are almost out of the time, right? So the traditional construction practices are modernized. So there is no kind of romantic lens to it, because there are a lot of issues and problems with traditional houses. So yes, so they are improved upon, they are scientifically improved upon and then used. And ability to work with the communities was an important aspect, which not every architect trained in the way we train people is able to do it, and that is why it is not very mainstream. It's difficult to practice like that. Yes. I don't know, because time is already out, so
we're
I
out of
leave
time.
it to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smita Davi, for this awesome, lovely presentation. And we are going to begin the next session in another 5 minutes. Thank you.